Stepmom tried to leave me with nothing after my father died. My name's Sarah, and I guess you could say I've had a unique upbringing. Some people grow up surrounded by a big family, or maybe just their mom or dad. For me, though, it was always just Nana and Pop, my grandparents. They took me in after life got complicated early on. My mom passed away before I even knew her, leaving a gap that no one could quite fill, no matter how many photos or stories they told me. And my dad, well, he stuck around just long enough for me to start asking questions about him. Then, just like that, he was gone too. I was only 5, but the memory's clear as day. I'd tug on Nana's sleeve almost every night, asking her when he'd be back. She'd look down at me with a soft, understanding smile, her hands gently tucking me into bed, and say, "Don't worry about that now, sweetheart." Over time, I learned to stop asking. Sometimes, silence speaks louder than any words ever could. Growing up with my grandparents wasn't exactly a storybook life, but it was stable and filled with love. We didn't have much. Pop worked his whole life at the factory, and Nana juggled odd jobs all over town to make ends meet. Looking back, it amazes me how they still managed to give me the world in their own way. Pop, who barely spoke more than a handful of words at a time, would find these little ways to let me know he cared. Sometimes, I'd open my lunch at school and find a handful of chocolates he'd snuck in there without Nana noticing. Those tiny gestures said everything. And Nana, she was the rock. When Pop got laid off during the factory closures, she picked up more shifts, doing everything from working in a local store to cleaning houses for people who seemed like they had everything. On my first day of school, she handed me this bright pink backpack with cartoon characters printed all over it. I found out later she'd saved up for months just to buy it. I loved that backpack so much, I carried it everywhere until it was practically in shreds. Somehow, in all the chaos, they gave me a sense of home and comfort that most kids probably take for granted. Looking back, I think that's what kept me strong, knowing that whatever happened, I had them. Nana and Pop were my whole world. By the time I hit middle school, I started noticing just how different my life was from other kids. Most of my classmates had parents waiting for them after school or taking them to after-school activities. Me, Nana would try to make it when she could, but her schedule was all over the place. And Pop, with his stiff joints and worn-down body, could only do so much. If he picked me up, we'd go straight home. Sometimes, I'd get a pat on the back, a gruff, "good job, kid," which from him felt like a standing ovation. One afternoon, we had a family day event at school. I was so proud to bring Nana and Pop, but seeing other kids' parents, dressed up in their business clothes or fresh out of their cars with coffee cups still in hand, I felt this little pang inside me. My grandparents were a little rough around the edges, Pop with his old flannel and Nana in her work uniform. I worried, just for a second, that maybe they'd stand out. But the way Nana held my hand so proudly, like I was her biggest accomplishment, made me push that thought away. We didn't have much, but we had each other. And that was enough. As I got older, I realized more and more just how much they sacrificed for me. Nana would work herself to the bone, and Pop, even with all his aches and pains, never missed a chance to show up for me, even if it was just watching me work on homework at the kitchen table. When I started talking about going to good high school, Nana didn't hesitate to support me, even though I knew we'd barely make it work. I studied hard, and when I finally got into the top public school in our district, their faces lit up like Christmas morning. Pop, usually so serious, wrapped me in this big bear hug, holding on for a second longer than usual. When he pulled back, I saw something I hadn't before, a tear sliding down his cheek. That little moment, seeing him break like that, it hit me hard. I realized that even though they never said it, they wanted the best for me, more than anything else. And from that day on, I was determined to make them proud. High school brought a new kind of challenge. I spent a lot of time buried in books, determined to live up to the hopes Nana and Pop had for me. But between school, my part-time job at a local store, and helping around the house, I started to notice things shifting at home. Pop, who'd always been steady, strong in that quiet way, was slowing down. At first, I thought he was just getting older. He'd worked so hard his whole life that a little wear and tear seemed normal. But it wasn't just age. Nana would whisper things to him when she thought I couldn't hear, little reminders to take his medication, or asking if he'd made it to his doctor's appointment. Then one day, I came home from school, and there was Pop, lying on the couch looking worn out and pale. Nana told me he'd had a spell at work and was sent home early. I wanted to ask questions to know how serious it was, but one look from Nana stopped me in my tracks. I could see the worry etched deep in her face. And for the first time, I understood that Pop was in real trouble. They didn't tell me much, but I started putting pieces together on my own. He was in and out of the hospital more often each time, and each time he came home, he seemed a little smaller, a little quieter. He still tried to make things feel normal. He'd sneak me those candies or tell me to stay up late to watch the old westerns with him, like nothing was wrong. But I could feel it, this weight hanging over us, making everything feel fragile. I wanted to help, to somehow ease the load that had fallen so heavily on Nana. I took on extra shifts at the store, put my paycheck straight into the household budget, and picked up more chores at home. Watching Nana juggle too, sometimes 3 jobs, just to cover Pop's medical bills made me feel like I was drowning, but I couldn't let her see that. She'd come home, exhausted but smiling, saying, "We're all right, Sarah. We're all right." But I knew she was only saying it for my sake. Every day, I wondered how much longer things could go on like this. The next few months were a blur of hospital visits, late nights, and worry that settled in like a permanent ache. Pop had good days and bad days, though the bad ones started to outnumber the good. Sometimes he'd sit out on the back porch with me, staring off into the yard, his face lost in thought. One night, we were out there as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting everything in that soft, orange glow. I sat beside him quietly, neither of us saying much. Then he reached over, his rough, calloused hand patting mine. "You're a good girl, Sarah. You make me proud every day," he said, voice barely above a whisper. I held back tears, swallowing the lump in my throat as I squeezed his hand back, not trusting myself to speak. He looked at me like he wanted to say more, but just didn't have the strength. It was moments like those that kept me going. Nana, meanwhile, was a force of nature, working almost every waking hour just to stay on top of things. She'd leave before dawn, coming home late at night, shoulders slumped with exhaustion, eyes ringed with dark circles. I could see her trying to put on a brave face, acting like she wasn't carrying the world on her shoulders. Sometimes, she'd come home and go straight to the kitchen, chopping vegetables with a quickness that seemed born more out of habit than energy. I'd help her, silently taking over as she sagged into a chair, rubbing her hands like they were aching from all the cleaning and scrubbing she did for other people. Every once in a while, when she thought I was out of earshot, I'd hear her talking to herself, whispering prayers under her breath, begging for strength for Pop to make it another day. It was a side of her I rarely saw, the worry, the vulnerability, and it scared me. I took on as much as I could to lighten her load, cooking, cleaning, whatever was needed. My routine became school, work, home, repeat. Some of my friends noticed, asking why I couldn't hang out after school, why I didn't go to the football games or dances. I'd just shrug it off with a maybe next time, though deep down, I knew there wouldn't be a next time. One night, Nana came home particularly late. I kept dinner warm for her, leftover stew that I'd added some spices to, hoping to make it a little better than usual. She sat down with a tired smile, and as she took a bite, her eyes softened. "This is good, Sarah," she said, reaching out to pat my hand. I noticed how rough her hands were, red and cracked from scrubbing floors all day. "You didn't have to wait up, honey." "I wanted to," I replied, watching as she ate. I could see the weight of everything she was carrying, the worry for Pop, the bills piling up, the never-ending days of work. And suddenly, the house we'd always filled with laughter and warmth felt heavy, like all of it was too much for the walls to hold. I realized then that Nana and Pop weren't invincible, that one day it would just be me. That thought terrified me, but I knew I couldn't let them down. For them, I had to be strong. Pop's health continued to slip, and one day, we got the call we'd been dreading. The doctor said he needed to stay in the hospital full-time. I remember that day like a snapshot. How Nana clutched the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. How she quietly nodded and thanked the nurse before hanging up. Then, without a word, she reached over, took my hand, and squeezed it. That night, we packed a small bag for him, putting in his favorite plaid flannel, his well-worn Bible, and a few family photos. Nana carefully tucked in a photograph of us on a fishing trip from years ago. Pop didn't fish much, but he'd come along just to watch us, sitting quietly on the bank while we laughed and splashed in the water. I remember him smiling that whole afternoon, more at peace than I'd ever seen him. Nana lingered over the photo, tracing her finger along his face, as though she was trying to capture every last bit of him in her memory. At the hospital, Pop's room was small and sterile, a far cry from the warmth of our home. Machines beeped steadily, their sounds cold and relentless. Pop looked small in that bed, his face pale and drawn, though he tried to give us one of his old familiar smiles when we walked in. I could tell he was trying to be strong for us, just like always. We spent hours there every day. I'd sit by his bed, talking to him about school, my job, or any small thing I thought might keep his mind off the pain. Sometimes he'd listen, nodding or grunting in his usual way, but other times he'd drift off mid-sentence, his hands slipping out of mine as sleep took him. Nana would sit in the chair on the other side, knitting something quietly, her hands never stopping even as she watched him with a sadness I'd never seen before. One afternoon, as I was reading a book out loud to him, he suddenly reached over, covering my hand with his own. I looked up to see him watching me, his eyes softer, full of something I couldn't quite name. "Sarah," he said, his voice a faint rasp, promise you'll look after Nana." I nodded, the words catching in my throat as I tried to keep my face steady. "I will, Pop. I promise." He nodded, closing his eyes as his hand fell back onto the bed, a faint smile playing on his lips. And I think that in his own quiet way, he was saying goodbye. Those days in the hospital felt like they stretched on forever, a blur of waiting rooms, hushed conversations, and watching the slow, inevitable fading of someone I loved more than words could say. Pop passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning. Nana and I were by his side, holding his hands as he took his last breath. There were no grand goodbyes, no final words, just a peaceful silence settling over him. His face finally relaxed, free of pain. We stayed there a long while, just the two of us, each lost in our own grief. When the nurse finally came in, Nana kissed his forehead, whispered something too soft for me to hear, and slowly let go of his hand. The days that followed felt like wading through thick fog. The house was so quiet, like it was holding its breath. Nana kept herself busy, sorting through Pop's things, cleaning every corner of the house. She'd hum to herself while she worked, but her voice was so soft, and sometimes it would break. At night, I'd hear her in her room, softly murmuring the prayers she used to say with him before bed. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her I was there, but I could tell she needed to grieve in her own way. A few days after the funeral, when things had just begun to settle, the phone rang. I answered it without thinking, my mind still caught in a haze of sadness. "Hello," I murmured, my voice heavy and tired. A woman's voice crackled on the other end. "Sarah, this is Marie, your father's wife. I'm so sorry for your loss." Her tone was smooth, too smooth, like she was trying to sound warm but couldn't quite get there. It took me a second to process who she was and what she was saying. My father's wife, the woman who had taken his place in a life he'd chosen over me. "Oh, thank you," I said, feeling numb, not sure what else to say. She paused, as if choosing her words carefully. "Listen, Sarah, I don't know how to put this delicately, but your father passed away in an accident a few weeks ago." Her voice was matter-of-fact, lacking any trace of grief. I blinked, stunned, trying to wrap my head around the news. He was gone, just like that. A man who had vanished from my life so long ago was now gone for good. I felt nothing, no sadness, no anger, just a hollow emptiness. But then her tone shifted, growing a little colder, more businesslike. "There's, well, an inheritance. I'm sure you understand. But to finalize things, I need you to sign some papers to waive your share." He wanted everything to go to me. I felt a sudden surge of bitterness, sharp and unexpected. This woman, this stranger, was asking me to give up any claim I had to my father's legacy. The man who'd left me behind without a second thought. She didn't even bother with pleasantries, just jumped straight to the point. "Nana, and I will need to think about that," I replied, my voice calm but firm. Her response was quick, almost defensive. Look, it's what he wanted. I'm just honoring his wishes. I could feel my heart pounding, anger simmering just beneath the surface. Thank you for calling. I'll be in touch. And with that, I hung up, my hand shaking as I placed the phone back on the receiver. I looked over at Nana, who had heard everything, her face set in a calm, determined expression. She walked over, wrapping her arms around me, and whispered, "We'll fight for what's right, Sarah. Your father may have left, but that doesn't mean he can take everything from you, too." In that moment, I knew that Pop might be gone, but Nana and I still had each other. And together, we'd face whatever came next. Pop passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning. Nana and I were by his side, holding his hands as he took his last breath. There were no grand goodbyes, no final words, just a peaceful silence settling over him. His face finally relaxed, free of pain. We stayed there a long while, just the two of us, each lost in our own grief. When the nurse finally came in, Nana kissed his forehead, whispered something too soft for me to hear, and slowly let go of his hand. The days that followed felt like wading through thick fog. The house was so quiet, like it was holding its breath. Nana kept herself busy, sorting through Pop's things, cleaning every corner of the house. She'd hum to herself while she worked, but her voice was so soft, and sometimes it would break. At night, I'd hear her in her room, softly murmuring the prayers she used to say with him before bed. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her I was there, but I could tell she needed to grieve in her own way. A few days after the funeral, when things had just begun to settle, the phone rang. I answered it without thinking, my mind still caught in a haze of sadness. "Hello," I murmured, my voice heavy and tired. A woman's voice crackled on the other end. "Sarah, this is Marie, your father's wife. I'm so sorry for your loss." Her tone was smooth, too smooth, like she was trying to sound warm but couldn't quite get there. It took me a second to process who she was and what she was saying. My father's wife. The woman who had taken his place in a life he'd chosen over me. "Oh, thank you," I said, feeling numb, not sure what else to say. She paused, as if choosing her words carefully. "Listen, Sarah, I don't know how to put this delicately, but your father passed away in an accident a few weeks ago." Her voice was matter-of-fact, lacking any trace of grief. I blinked, stunned, trying to wrap my head around the news. He was gone just like that. A man who had vanished from my life so long ago was now gone for good. I felt nothing, no sadness, no anger, just a hollow emptiness. But then her tone shifted, growing a little colder, more businesslike. "There's, well, an inheritance. I'm sure you understand. But to finalize things, I need you to sign some papers to waive your share." He wanted everything to go to me. I felt a sudden surge of bitterness, sharp and unexpected. This woman, this stranger, was asking me to give up any claim I had to my father's legacy. The man who'd left me behind without a second thought. She didn't even bother with pleasantries, just jumped straight to the point. "Nana and I will need to think about that," I replied, my voice calm but firm. Her response was quick, almost defensive. "Look, it's what he wanted. I'm just honoring his wishes." I could feel my heart pounding, anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Thank you for calling. I'll be in touch." And with that, I hung up, my hand shaking as I placed the phone back on the receiver. I looked over at Nana, who had heard everything, her face set in a calm, determined expression. She walked over, wrapping her arms around me, and whispered, "We'll fight for what's right, Sarah. Your father may have left, but that doesn't mean he can take everything from you, too." In that moment, I knew that Pop might be gone, but Nana and I still had each other. And together, we'd face whatever came next. After that call, it was like a switch flipped inside me. I'd spent my whole life not thinking much about my father, convincing myself I didn't need him, that I was better off with Nana and Pop. And maybe I was. But now, this woman, this Marie, wanted me to just step aside, like I was nothing, like I hadn't even existed in his life. It hurt more than I expected. It was a strange kind of hurt, not for the father I'd lost, but for the place I'd been forced out of, the place he'd left me behind. Nana, though, was unfazed. That night, she sat down with me at the kitchen table, pulling out her old reading glasses and a notepad she used for budgeting. She'd already called a local lawyer, a man she knew from church who didn't take kindly to folks getting pushed around. "We'll make sure she knows that you have a right to your share, Sarah," Nana said, her voice steady and certain as she jotted down some notes. "This is about more than just money." For the first time in a while, I saw that fire in her eyes. The same look she'd get when she was determined to make things right, to protect me from anything she saw as unfair or hurtful. And I could tell that standing up to this woman was as much for Pop as it was for me. She had worked her entire life, put everything into giving me a chance, and I wasn't about to let someone take that from us. The next day, we met with Mr. Daniels, the lawyer. He was older, with a warm smile and a slow, deliberate way of speaking. He looked over the paperwork that Marie had sent, her demands for me to waive any claim to my father's estate. He shook his head, his mouth set in a tight line. "You know," he said, glancing over the rims of his glasses at us, "I've seen this before. People coming out of nowhere, trying to claim what they think they're entitled to. But Sarah, legally, you are entitled to a portion of this estate, no matter what anyone says." He looked over at Nana, who nodded approvingly, her mouth pressed into a firm line. I didn't need to say much. Nana did most of the talking, explaining that we wouldn't back down, that we intended to claim what was rightfully mine. She was direct, polite, but I could tell from her tone that she wouldn't budge an inch. For once, I was glad for her stubbornness, glad for the fire in her that had kept us going all these years. Mr. Daniels assured us he'd start the process and that he'd be in touch with Marie's lawyer. As we left his office, I felt a strange sense of strength, a feeling like maybe, just maybe, I could stand up for myself, for my family, and finally have a piece of the life my father had chosen to leave behind. On the way home, Nana squeezed my hand, her grip warm and steady. "You're doing the right thing, Sarah," she said, her eyes softening as she looked at me. "This isn't just about money. It's about showing them that you matter, that you're worth standing up for." I nodded, taking a deep breath as I looked out the car window, watching the familiar streets of our town pass by. And for the first time, I felt that maybe this fight wasn't just about getting my share. It was about reclaiming a piece of myself that had been stolen from me long ago. The weeks that followed were tense. Marie's lawyer fired back quickly, sending letters full of legal jargon meant to scare us into giving up. But each time one arrived, Nana and I would sit down with Mr. Daniels, who calmly assured us we were still on solid ground. "They're just trying to rattle you," he'd say with a gentle smile, as if he'd seen people like Marie and her lawyer 1,000 times before. "They think if they push hard enough, you'll fold. But I don't see any folding happening here." One evening, after yet another letter arrived demanding I waive my rights, Nana set the letter down on the table with a small sigh. She looked tired, worn down from all the fighting, but when she met my eyes, her determination hadn't budged an inch. "It's funny, you know," she said almost to herself. "Your father never once came back, not even to check if you were okay, not even a phone call. But now, here he is, or rather, his money is causing us more grief than he ever did in life." I could see the sadness in her eyes, the memory of all the years he'd been gone, all the time she'd had to answer my questions about him, telling me he'd probably found a new life somewhere else. There was pain there, but there was anger too. Anger at the mess he'd left behind, the fight he'd saddled us with. A few days later, another call came from Marie. I didn't want to answer, but Nana nodded, giving me a look that told me to stay strong. I picked up the phone, bracing myself for her smooth, calculated voice. "Sarah," she began, her tone edged with impatience. "I thought I made myself clear. Your father wanted everything to go to me. I'm only asking for you to respect his wishes." I clenched my jaw, taking a deep breath before I replied. "He may have wanted that, Marie, but he never put it in writing. Legally, I have a claim, and I'm not backing down." My voice sounded stronger than I felt, but the words came out firm, steady. She let out a long sigh. "Fine, but you should know you're making this more difficult than it needs to be. There's no point in clinging to something that was never meant for you." Her words were sharp, designed to cut, to remind me that in her eyes, I was nothing more than an inconvenience. I swallowed hard, anger flaring up inside me. Maybe my father didn't want me, Marie, but that doesn't mean I don't deserve my share. You might have known him in the end, but I knew him first. And I'm not walking away empty-handed. The silence on the other end was thick, like she was stunned that I dared to stand up to her. After a long pause, she muttered something about speaking to her lawyer, then hung up. When I set the phone down, my hands were shaking, but Nana was right there, her hand resting over mine, steady and warm. "I'm proud of you, Sarah," she said softly, her eyes shining with pride. It takes guts to stand up to people like her, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was truly standing up for myself, for the life Nana and Pop had worked so hard to give me. This wasn't just about money. It was about proving that I mattered, that I had every right to claim what was mine, no matter what anyone else thought. Things escalated after that call. Marie must have been rattled, because her lawyer hit back with threats of a lengthy court battle, insinuating we didn't stand a chance. Mr. Daniels, however, was unfazed. He reassured us, explaining in simple terms that while Marie might have been my father's wife, she couldn't just erase me from the picture. But I could tell Nana was getting tired. The fight was wearing her down, and every day she seemed a little more worn, a little quieter. I did my best to carry some of the weight, taking on more hours at the store, making dinners, trying to be the steady one, the strong one. But sometimes, at night, I'd hear her muffled sobs from her room, the sounds breaking through the walls as if the weight of everything was finally catching up to her. One evening, after another long meeting with Mr. Daniels, Nana and I sat at the kitchen table, the remnants of dinner still scattered between us. She looked down at her hands, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her napkin, deep in thought. "Sarah," she started, her voice soft, "do you ever think about what you'll do with this inheritance if we manage to win it?" I hadn't let myself think that far. I was so focused on the fight, on holding my ground, that I hadn't allowed myself to imagine actually having anything to show for it. "I don't know," I admitted, shrugging. "I guess I just want us to be comfortable. You could stop working so hard, Nana. We wouldn't have to worry about every little thing." She looked up at me, her eyes glistening with tears. "You got a good heart, Sarah. Always thinking of others." She paused, reaching across the table to take my hand. "But don't forget, you deserve good things too. You've been taking care of me for so long, when it should have been the other way around." The next morning, I woke up to a surprise. Nana had left a small envelope on the kitchen table, propped up against my coffee cup. Inside was a worn, creased photograph of Pop holding me as a little girl, his face beaming with pride. Beneath the photo was a note in Nana's familiar, slightly shaky handwriting. "You're his legacy, Sarah. And mine too." I don't know why, but that little note made everything feel more real. I was fighting not just for myself, but for Pop, for Nana, for everything they'd worked so hard to give me. And I realized then that winning this wasn't just about the inheritance. It was about honoring them, their sacrifices, and the life they'd built for me out of pure love. With renewed determination, I folded up the note, slipped it into my pocket, and went about my day with a sense of purpose that ran deeper than I'd ever known. As the days went on, Nana's health started to show signs of strain. She moved a bit slower, took longer to catch her breath, and some mornings, she'd just sit in her chair by the window, gazing out in silence. I tried to distract her with small talk, reminding her about Mr. Daniels' latest updates or talking about new recipes I wanted to try. She'd smile, but her usual fire was dimming. I felt that weight too, like a constant, invisible pressure pushing down on us both. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, she suddenly slumped against the counter, her hand gripping it for support. My heart jumped into my throat as I rushed her aside, guiding her gently to a chair. "Nana, are you all right?" I asked, panic lacing my voice. She waved a hand dismissively, trying to brush it off. "I'm fine, honey. Just a little tired, that's all." But her face was pale, and I could see a faint tremor in her hands. I knew that look. She was trying to be strong, to hide her exhaustion, but she was wearing herself thin. The next morning, I insisted she go to the doctor. She resisted at first, saying we didn't have the time or money for another doctor's visit, but I wouldn't take no for an answer. I even called Mr. Daniels, who kindly offered to drive us to the clinic himself. He knew how much Nana meant to me, and he didn't hesitate to help when he saw how worried I was. The doctor's office was cold, all white walls and sharp smells. We sat in silence as the doctor examined Nana, her face lined with that stubborn determination she always wore when she was hiding something. After a while, the doctor called me into his office alone. He looked at me with a gentle but serious expression that made my stomach twist. "She's exhausted, Sarah. Her body's been under a lot of stress, and it's catching up to her," he explained. "She needs rest, real rest. No more work, no more stress." I nodded, feeling that familiar mix of guilt and worry. She'd spent her whole life pushing herself, holding everything together. And now, in these last few years, she was still holding on, fighting battles that should have never been hers. I felt the weight of it all pressed down on me as I left the office, knowing that from now on, it was on me to protect her, to keep things stable. That night, we sat together, sipping tea in the living room. Nana looked over at me, her face softened by the dim glow of the lamp, and for a moment, she looked tired and frail in a way I'd never seen before. "Sarah," she began quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "when all this is over, I want you to promise me something." "Anything, Nana," I said, my throat tight. She reached out, taking my hand in hers, her grip warm but weak. "Promise me that you'll live your life. Really live it. You've been taking care of everyone else for so long. Don't let this fight, or me, hold you back." I nodded, feeling tears sting my eyes, her words sinking deep into me. I didn't know how I'd ever get by without her. Didn't know who I'd be without her steady presence in my life. But I knew, deep down, that she was right. She had sacrificed so much to raise me, to give me a future. And if I could give her any peace, it would be that promise. To live, to thrive, to make the life she'd always dreamed of for me. With that promise in my heart, I knew I couldn't let anyone, not Marie, not anyone, take away the future Nana and Pop had worked so hard to give me. The court battle dragged on longer than we'd hoped. Marie's lawyer was ruthless, digging up every excuse to delay the case, probably hoping we'd give up out of exhaustion. Each new letter or summons felt like a fresh weight pressing down on me. But I held tight to Nana's words, that promise I'd made to live, to make this fight count, to secure a future where we'd finally be free of all these burdens. I found myself going to visit Pop's grave more often. I'd sit beside the simple headstone Nana had picked, tracing his name with my fingers, trying to find strength in the memory of his quiet resilience. Sometimes I'd talk to him, filling him in on the case or telling him how tired Nana was getting, as if he could somehow send us a sign to keep going. One evening, as I sat there, I realized that this fight wasn't just about me or Nana. It was for Pop, too. For all those years he'd put in, making sure I had a roof over my head, food on my plate, and a little love even when he didn't have much to give. Then, one afternoon, we got the call we'd been waiting for. Mr. Daniels had finally negotiated a settlement. Marie, maybe realizing we wouldn't back down, had agreed to split my father's estate evenly, just as the law required. I felt a strange mix of relief and anger as I listened to Mr. Daniels explain the details over the phone. Relief because we'd won, and anger because Marie had put us through so much to get here. That evening I told Nana the news. She sat there, taking it in, a faint smile softening her tired face. "So, it's done then?" she asked, her voice so quiet I almost didn't hear her. "It's done," I replied, nodding. "We did it, Nana." For the first time in what felt like forever, she let out a long, deep breath, her shoulders finally relaxing. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sadness. "Your Pop would be proud of you, Sarah. I know he would." We sat there in silence for a long time, the weight of the fight slowly lifting, replaced by a calm, steady warmth. I felt that something had shifted, that a door had finally opened for us, leading to a life we'd only ever dreamed of. Later that night, I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, feeling a strange emptiness alongside the relief. Winning hadn't brought Pop back, hadn't erased the years of struggle, but it had brought us something, a future, a chance to breathe, to dream without fear. I thought about what Nana had asked of me, about her quiet, hopeful plea for me to live my life fully. And lying there in the dark, I made a promise to myself that I'd honor that wish. I'd build something out of all this, something Pop and Nana would be proud of. For the first time, I wasn't just holding on for them. I was holding on for me too.